Daily Solutions. Daily Solutions.
Hey, everyone.
Hey.
Welcome to the Daily Solutions podcast with me, Graham.
And me, Ashkahn.
And today's question is, my float tank came without a flow meter on it. Are they important?
Oh, yeah. I got a lot to say about flow meters.
Yeah, me too. So I guess we're going to have to fight over this one.
Okay, so what is a flow meter? We should start by...
Okay, what's a flow meter?
All right.
It is a meter designed to measure the flow of solution through your filtration system.
Yeah. So, if your pump is usually you hear this about your pump. It's rated to do whatever, 50 gallons per minute, 40 gallons per minute, something like that. So why is it important?
I guess, so let's back up a little bit. So your pump is rated for a certain amount.
Yeah.
And there's also this idea of ideal flow that you would get if this thing were just shooting directly into whatever it's shooting into, versus what actually happens, which is you have to calculate this whole dynamic head and
right, which is why it's important. So it's I will say a few things first. That I don't think every system needs a flow meter. Specifically, I don't think systems with reservoir systems need a flow meter.
Sure.
Because really, like, your big concern about flow has to do with turnovers. Like your system is supposed to, you're going through this idea of doing a certain amount of turnovers between each float, and your flow meter is telling you what the flow is, and that's how you know you're doing the turnovers that you're supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the concept. And, I think some things that are interesting to know is that if you were to be running like a pool or something like that, a commercial pool, you definitely have a flow meter on it. I mean, it's usually required legally. Like when an inspector comes, it's one of the first things they're checking is your flow meter. And I will say there's some distinction between the necessity of it on a pool versus a float tank. And in my mind, that comes in part because of the fact that float tanks are kind of like identical units that are manufactured as a unit, right? Like when someone goes and builds a commercial pool, they're building it into that spot and they're working with that area and they're doing all that sort of stuff. And so once they build everything, they want to have a flow meter to make sure everything's, going a certain speed and everything's working correctly. Whereas on a float tank, if a manufacturer is doing something where the piping is the same and their filtration system's the same and everything is pretty much the same as it is in their factory while they're making it, they should be able to test the flow there, and that's going to be representative of the flow that it's going to be doing in your place.
And so the problem, though, with that, even if they have a really nice flow meter and they're getting it accurate, is what if your pump system gets gummed up, or what if something is getting in the way of that flow? You're not going to know unless you have a meter on your own tank.
Yeah, and so that's why we really like flow meters. Like we'll put them onto float tanks that we have that don't have them kind of afterwards ourselves. And that is one of the nice things. It's one of the easiest things to add to your filtration system yourself, which is nice. Like it's not anywhere as hard as changing the pump that came with your float tank or a filter or anything like that. Like adding a flow meter on usually just requires cutting off the right chunk of pipe and putting it on in place of that. So it's nice. We check our flow every morning, and it's just to make sure that things are operating correctly. And what can happen is, like if you get a bunch of hair caught up in your strainer basket on your pump or your impeller or something like that, you're going to see that on your flow meter. You're going to come in one morning and all of a sudden the flow is going to be 10 gallons per minute less than it normally is every morning when you go check it. And for us, it's just like a really nice way to like make sure everything is kind of at least operating a certain amount of normal really fast just by looking at this one thing and checking the number on it.
Yeah, I mean, you can't even catch when something's going horribly wrong and all of a sudden it's down at 10 gallons per minute and something is it's like actually just shoved up against the suction on the tank, or there's all kinds of problems that just really quickly being able to check your flow can alert you of before it causes serious damage to your equipment. Because oftentimes if your flow is a lot less than you're expecting, it's because like something's going horribly wrong and it's about to go worse if you don't fix it.
And it's mostly like most of the time it's hair stuck somewhere. That's like almost always what it is. Hair is stuck somewhere and you got to go deal with it. I should say though that you don't actually need a flow meter to do this. There are ways to calculate this without having a flow meter.
Yep.
There's ways to do it kind of theoretically with no additional equipment, which is what Graham was talking about, the kind of total dynamic head where you measure your pipe length and back pressure and all that sort of stuff, and you get a number and you base it off your pump curve and I don't know. All that to me is a little too theoretical to use practically. And then there's the method where you can, if you have the ability to measure pressure before and after your pump, there are calculations you can use to just take those pressure readings, pump them into a calculation, and it'll tell you what your flow rate is. But that is some amount of, you need to have the pressure sensor or the PSI kind of readers in the right place on your system. So there's some equipment in that scenario as well. So the flow meter is not the only way to accomplish this goal, but I find it to be the easiest because it's literally just the thing that reads the flow. I've
known centers too that measure it, especially when their system's first installed, to kind of pass their health department inspection without having a flow meter.
Yeah.
Of just actually doing a 5-gallon bucket test. So opening up a part of their spa pack basically and having the water flow into a 5-gallon bucket and timing how fast it takes to fill up that 5-gallon bucket and then doing some math to figure out the flow. And I know at least one place that does that every time their health department comes in. That's because their health department needs to know the flow rate. So they do this bucket test every single time. Wow. Just, okay, take it off, measure how long it takes to fill this up. You're good to go.
That's crazy. So, I mean, that's another thing to consider. Some health departments just require flow meters.
Yeah.
And you're going to want to have one.
And that's the biggest, honestly, I think that's the biggest reason people end up asking questions like today is, are these important? My health department's saying that I need one.
Yeah. So I get to summarize, I would say that they're not as important as they are in like a pool for a few reasons. Mm-hmm. Although I still really like having them, and I enjoy being able to look at them while we run our float center.
Pet them.
Nice. Yeah.
Take them out to a nice dinner occasionally.
Put tiny bow ties on them. And the reason that you was saying before that I don't think is important for a reservoir system is because you don't really care about turnover in a reservoir. Like, you just need the water to go into the...
It doesn't really matter how fast it goes.
Like
everything is passing through the filtration system, so...
Right. So the flow rate doesn't really matter, and you don't really need to measure it. And although I guess it could still be nice just to know if something's unusual, right? But you could, I guess, just time. You could just time how long it takes. So I don't know. Way, way less important in my mind in a reservoir system.
So there are right and wrong flow meters to use for your float tanks.
Uh-huh.
And we know one right one. And we know that there are a lot of wrong ones out there. But beyond that, I don't have a ton of answers. So
I guess it's, more because we know that the right one had to be made to be right.
Yeah, we have a strong suspicion that there are...
It makes me skeptical
very few
of all the other ones.
To none that are out there that haven't been made for float tanks. Well, just, again, skeptical.
So, I mean, and the company is H2 Flow. And this guy was, making these things called the FlowViz is the name of the product, the flow meters. And a lot of float tanks were using them. And I think he realized that all these float tanks were buying this flow meter. And he was wondering, hey, are these things actually accurate with the salt, the density of liquid going through there? And so he tests it and finds that, in fact, they are not accurate with the salt water, which, is a very common story you find with equipment being used on float tanks.
Yeah, like every piece of equipment ever, yeah.
But they go further, H2 Flow, and actually make a float tank specific flow meter. So it's actually calibrated for float tanks. It's calibrated, I think, for 1.26 specific gravity, I want to say, but I might be wrong about that. It might be slightly different. So just know that it's still, if you're at a different specific gravity than it's calibrated for, it'll still be a little bit off, but it won't be nearly as off as just like the non-float tank ones that they were making.
Yep, and it's not on a linear scale, so it's not just a 1-to-1 of it's always off by this amount.
Yeah,
kind of goes on a little bit of a
knock 10 off or something.
Curve. Yeah, but that was about what it is, right? Is that a lot of the flow meters are overstating their flow.
Yeah.
So when you actually put the float tank specific one on there, your flow is going to read less if you haven't used that previously. And we found by about 10 gallons a minute, or sometimes
at around the speeds that we're doing.
Yep,
yeah,
exactly.
From 5 to 10 gallons per
minute. At around 50 to 70 gallons a minute. That's decreasing by about 10 or so.
Yeah. So good. They say the float tank specific ones on their website, or you can email them. I always forget the letter. It's like the FlowViz S, I think, for saline.
Yeah.
So definitely, if you're gonna add a flow meter, it's the one I would recommend getting. So
there you have it. We think they're important, but they're certainly not 100% necessary unless you're legally being required to have them, in which case, they're necessary.
Yeah. Okie dokie. Well, if you guys have other questions, hop on over to floattankSolutions.com/podcast, and we'll talk about them,
Talk to you all tomorrow.
Right.